Hey, it's the show. Welcome to the show. Thanks everyone for your questions. Let's get right into it. We'll start with the very first one. This will give the people what they want. And why don't we just start by walking into a minefield of the current event, geopolitics, and okay, here we go. But luckily I feel very confident in the kind of answer we can give. This is from Lane, who asks, we are told that the Jews are God's chosen people. Because of this, Joshua was told he could go into Canaan, take the promised land, and kill every man, woman, and child. I'm inclined to question the credibility of the Old Testament because of that story. What can we do with this story in light of what Benjamin Netanyahu is doing today? So I feel like I've been a Swedenborgian my whole life, meaning I've never had the Bible in my life without Swedenborg's explanation of what it is and how it works. And I don't know what I would do with the Old Testament if I didn't have that. I probably wouldn't. I don't think I would be Christian. I don't know if I would, because well, you know what I'd probably do is like what most Christians do, which is like there's parts that are really great. Like I love the 23rd Psalm. I don't know what this is. This like God saying to some people, you go and kill all the other people. The reason why I feel totally fine with that story in the Old Testament is that the Old Testament's not actually about any of that. Like the Old Testament is not about the Jews. And the Jews were not God's chosen people in the way that people think of that. The whole thing is representative. Just like it's not actually about the days of the creation of the universe. The creation story is not about the literal days of the creation. All these stories are about are an allegory for the universal story of the way that the Lord brings us from hell into heaven, or of the universal human spiritual path. So we made a video on this channel saying wars in Israel and Palestine and wherever have nothing to do with the Bible or with biblical prophecy or thinking about end times. That's not what it's about. Divine doesn't have favorites or think about the divine never thinks about any one person differently than he thinks about any other person. So to me, Swedenborg's explanation of the correspondences and how when it talks about the Jews or about Israel, those are different parts inside you. When it talks about Canaan and it talks about the Philistines, those are other parts in you, and this is about how God reforms you. To me, so I never have to struggle with something like this. But if I didn't have that, I don't know what I would say. This is a terrible book. I don't want anyone to act like that. So I'm saying like thank goodness for Swedenborg. I mean, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Do you want to go, Cara? You're muted, I think. Oh,
She's
me
still
go.
saying for you to go, even when she can't speak, she's selfless. Like
No.
you go.
Yeah, absolutely, Curtis. I agree. What would we do without this information about what the Old Testament is for? It is those stories of the Israelites in Canaan are based on historical events, but the reason it was written down and was preserved as the Bible, that still exists today, is because of the allegory about our internal process that it can depict. And like you were saying, Curtis, that's what it's really for. It's nothing to do with earthly things. Jesus said, my kingdom is not of this world. And every time people tried to get him involved in earthly politics, he said, nope, I'm not going to get into that. It's about our spiritual journeys. And so the Israelites represent us, the spiritual part of us. And that's the chosen part of us. Doesn't mean one race on earth or nationality is more favored than others. It means there's a part in us that is more able to follow God, and that's what God calls to, calls to bring you out of earthliness, which is the representation of their bondage in Egypt, and bring you to the promised land, which is a heavenly state of mind. And the reason that there can be these violent stories and apparent terrible instructions by God is because of the representation. The people at those times were just doing that anyway. So it wasn't actually, that's what they thought God was saying, because that's the mentality. Think of all the different gods of that time, people, it was a power struggle, and which God is more powerful, who wins, who loses. But the Canaan is, the reason the text is saying you can kill every man, woman, and child is that's representations of the negative or harmful thoughts and feelings that can be in the way of, what is occupying the land there before the Israelites come in is a representation of the harmful thoughts and feelings that occupy our land, our inner self, until this process can take place that can dispel those and bring the spiritual part of us represented by the Israelites into Canaan.
It's like having inside you, this something like this happens physically. It happened to me twice in the last 2 weeks, where some little virus or something got into my body, and I got sick. And my immune system, go and kill everything that's in you, because otherwise, it's not. So that happened. There's a spirit like that. There's the same thing in your mind. There's the falsities and little evils from hell that will destroy your spirit, and you got to eradicate those. Like that's what it's talking about here. If it wasn't, then what? There was no more moral lesson in the Old Testament at all. Like what possible virtue do you get from a story like this? It only would be like loyalty. Like if you're loyal to God, then you'll have power over your enemies. But that's not a virtue, because if God's will is just arbitrary and like, okay, well, you can go and kill these people because these happen to be on the wrong side of my will. There is no morality. God's no different than any warlord anywhere. There's nothing to. I can't believe that people hold on to this thing, and I don't know what they get out of it or how they get something out of it. But there's nothing. There's no. There's in some parts of the Bible. It's like, oh yeah, there's obviously good qualities on display but not there, not in the stories of like the conquest of Canaan and everything. There's absolutely no morality present there. Only with the understanding of the spiritual sense is there anything that would be reminiscent of anything better than the worst of humanity's impulses,
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So it's very important to separate that from earthly, like geopolitical things. Yeah. They have nothing to do with each other, except in each person's heart and mind of like, what is the battle going on inside you, and what is being called and what is being, dispelled.
I love what you said, Corinne, about the people in the land, or whoever they're meant to go conquer, is what's just blocking our own access to a heavenly mindset. So it's really about all of us fighting our own inner enemies.
Yeah.
Well, let's give people an example so they can start to, like, we're talking about enemies, like enemies of the human race. So like what's something that can be in the land in you that needs to get out? Yeah.
Contempt for others.
So everybody knows, oh, my dogs are going to go insane here. I don't know if you can hear them. Everybody knows that ruins Thanksgiving. Everyone knows what it's like to live around someone who just throws contempt around. And the Bible is telling you, eradicate that from yourself. You go and do that in yourself. That's good for everyone all the time.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. And the like various family members mentioned, it's get rid of the justification for it, the feelings that go with it, the concept of it. This is like the men, women, and children, like all the things that go together in a family that make you contemptuous. Like we got to get rid of all those things, because it does harm. It's the enemy.
Wow. Yeah. All the different branches of any given negative feeling, thoughts, feelings, motivations. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's so good.
Absolutely.
Okay, I have contempt for my dogs. There's like,
Not
there's a
really. He
yap,
loves
and
it,
I got to get that out of the land. But if they had just done the work of like, I don't need to yap at everyone so much, then the rest of everything gets easier for the rest of the human race. Like we all have our little missions. That's right. They're doing the best they can.
But
Okay.
you know what? Also, one more thing. Just I just can't get over this. If you think about if every single person took on conquering the enemies in their own minds and hearts, like the world would change instantly. If everybody took on getting over contempt, looking for the good in others, trusting that God created us to do good things. I mean, the list goes on how you could name it, but it comes down to the individual work. And if people were willing to do that, this world would be a different place. It seems to me.
Yeah.
Maybe it's simplistic. I don't know.
Well, no. I think that would have yeah. If everybody bought into that, yeah, the world's problems will be eradicated pretty quickly. And I was reading one of the volumes of Secrets of Heaven recently, and no, it was the Doctrine of Life. It was the Doctrine of Life. I was reading it when I was on a trip, and it was talking about how the 10 Commandments are the first thing in the Word that ever got written. That's what he said, because they got written by God on stone tablets. Remember that?
Yeah.
Like, that was the beginning of the Word, was right then. Like later, the books of Moses are written about that event. Like that's the first thing that got written. And this symbolism of the Israelites who had this symbol carrying around those things in the ark, and that because Swedenborg says that's the summary of all of religion is those 10 Commandments, because within each of those, it tells you what the enemies are. It tells you. So, Cara, you're listing off things that all the things that you got to find and fight against yourself, should you find them, fall under the headings of "you shall not murder," which contains within it all kinds of rage and revenge and contempt. Don't commit adultery, which is all kinds of things that are destructive to marriage love. Don't steal, which has to do with the disbelief in the influence of the divine, or taking credit for things that are really God's. And so Swedenborg unpacks it. Everything's in there. And that's what religion is it's showing you these are the things, trying to get it so you can recognize the things. Because it's very hard to recognize the things, because all the things that are in the holy land of your heart, that are bad, they have their own pleasures that go with them. And we have a natural tendency to justify those things because they're ours, and want to keep them and not even recognize them. So the 10 Commandments and everything that flows from it, which is the whole word, is just equipping you to like, oh, that I can look at myself and actually call myself out accurately on things. That equips me to go do the hero's work that only I can do, because you two can't do that for me. And I can't do that for you. Not effectively. I can say you have this problem, but I don't really know if you even do. And the more that I annoy you about it, the less you're going to want to do anything. So nobody can do that work for anyone. But if we don't do it for ourselves, everything becomes a mess.
Amen.
Amen.
That's awesome. Okay, let's go to the next one. This is from Jen, who asks, can acting against conscience or deceitfully cause spiritual distress that could manifest as mental illness, e.g. as psychosis?
I found this a really interesting question, because I do find that Swedenborg talks about being internally divided is a state of inner distress. That the reason like temptations and spiritual trials are such as that two different things within you are struggling, what the goodwill part and the self-centered part. Acting against conscience. So if you have conscience, you have a part of you that knows this is the right way to be, and then you act opposed to your conscience, that is going to, give you inner unrest. And I wouldn't say, I don't think that would be the only cause of mental illness, but it certainly is a cause of inner distress and confusion and things like that. So it certainly can be, yeah. And yeah, I've read about, cases if like someone is exposed to some real conflicts early in life, like being harmed by the parent you love, or something that's creates this inner things that don't go together. That's
Yeah.
definitely like a hard thing to struggle with. So yeah, I think and Swedenborg witnessed that the peace of heaven is the Lord helping you to get your inner and outer, everything in your mind aligned, so there's nothing fighting against itself anymore. So those
Yeah.
are my first thoughts.
No, I love that. Let me, Carl, before I get to hear from you, let me just, I wanted to look up a definition of psychosis. So, because I sort of thought I knew what that word means, but this is what the internet says it means.
Yeah.
This is well, shoot, that's an AI overview, so we don't know if it's real or not. This is what it says in the AI overview. So psychosis is a term used to describe a group of symptoms that indicate a loss of contact with reality. Someone may experience during a psychotic episode hallucinations, delusions, which is believing things that aren't true, disordered thinking or speaking, cognitive symptoms, mood changes.
I remember somebody once juxtaposed it with the, like, depression is a mood disorder, but psychosis is a thought disorder, which was helpful for me to be able to hold on to it. Being accustomed to thinking about, feelings of thoughts.
Yeah. I don't think that acting, well, I don't think there's any indication in Swedenborg's writings that acting against conscience could cause mental illness. So he does talk about, well, for anyone who's not familiar, conscience is like kind of what you think it is, like Jiminy Cricket style, what's right, what's wrong. There's a bit more to it, as I learned from the NCE. Conscientia means sort of consciousness, but there's a fundamental, Swedenborg does seem to use it in the way of like acting against your conscience is, this is not good and you're doing it anyway. And Swedenborg says that having distress when you act against your conscience is good, because that means you have a conscience in the first place, which you don't necessarily have to have. You can have destroyed that thing in yourself or quieted it or something. But also it's what I think it's what he calls an internal bond. So there's external bonds and internal bonds. Like there's external bonds, which is like, I'm not going to speed through the school zone because I know there's a cop there and I'll get a ticket. That's an external bond. An internal bond would be, I'm not going to speed through the school zone because I don't want to risk hurting someone, because it's not right. So he does talk about experiencing distress if you act against your conscience. But the way I have understood it is it's not like something that lasts or is damaging. It's just kind of a like if you if you're like leaning on your wrist and bending it in a weird way and you're like, ow, I can't do that. I mean, that was my sense of how he describes it.
Yeah, that's a great point. That's different than what we would call mental illness. I mean, there's sort of things can cross over, right? I mean, things can sort of get started in one way and then go. But yeah, I think if we're really talking mental illness, it's a disconnection from rationality, isn't it? I mean, you kind of lose your sense of what's. I don't
want Jen or anyone to think like, oh, I'm experiencing symptoms of psychosis. Is it because I acted against my conscience?
Oh, yeah, right.
Like I don't think that's. Yeah, I don't think so. I don't think that's how it works. He doesn't like mental illness was only rudimentarily studied in Swedenborg's. Like there wasn't the field wasn't really there. He does talk about the influence of the spiritual world on things. that have a psychological nature, but there's just not enough common language to connect dots and things like that. So, but in general,
Yeah.
I don't get the sense that acting against your conscience, he doesn't give any indication that that can have lasting harmful effects on you.
It does seem more like what Karin was talking about, like trauma from the past, or what do they call it? Complex post-traumatic stress, like in a childhood situation where you can't depend on the responsible adults and things like that. Like that does seem to set people up for mental instability in a way. But like you say, Curtis, it's not acting against your own conscience. It's a state of disorder that has affected your inner life or something. I don't know.
Yeah. I just on the screen temporarily there was something from Clark Eccles there talking about something Van Dusen. Oh, Van Dusen shows us Swedenborg says that evil spirits attack the deceitful person who then appears mentally ill or even psychotic. Interesting. So that something can maybe look like something outwardly, even if it isn't actual psychosis. Or that's what I mean. Like things can get gray from our perspective, like where the lines are.
Yeah.
So, yeah,
And
but I agree with what you're saying, Curtis, that we don't think, oh, I'm psychotic because, yeah, like.
Well, I guess like, so in what I guess in the question, acting against conscience, are you talking about like you did it a few times or you did it once? Or are you talking about like if you were acting deceitfully habitually for a long time, could that have, but I guess when I hear like acting against conscience, like somebody who really got into deceit a lot would probably not have or would quickly abandon a conscience, because you wouldn't keep doing it if you really didn't think it was right, so yes, all behavior that's against those 10 commandments that we were just talking about attracts hell to you. But how that manifests in you, I think, is probably very complicated.
Yeah.
I think there's
It's not a one-on-one.
Like it's like as complicated as brain science. You couldn't just say like, if you're deceitful, then these evil spirits will do, because people can do very different things with very different results. Some people, so I think it's probably like the complexity of neuroscience plus the complexity of the spirituals. Like you probably have an order of magnitude more complex. So you couldn't say, if you do this, then he'll do that.
Yeah, I think that's a good.
So Clark is probably is referencing, I would guess, The Presence of Spirits and Madness by Van Dusen, which is, I love that whole treatise. For anyone who's not familiar, that's when there's a psychologist or psychiatrist named Wilson Van Dusen who published something through the Swedenborg Foundation, where he had a clinical practice for a long time, where he was working with people with psychosis and other things, and comparing the behaviors they had and the experiences they reported with Swedenborg's reports of evil spirits and how evil spirits in hell affect the mind. And he was seeing that like this is obviously the same sort of thing. So yeah, this is Symphony of God Ministries. Great questions and perspective, Dr. Curtis. We are not medical doctors. We don't know. I guess it's like you don't know. It's just like you go and Google your symptoms, and it's like, oh, turns out I'm in big trouble. You don't know, and even less so do we know something this complicated from Swedenborg.
Yeah, this rolls well into the next question, which I have a number.
Hit me with it. Hit me with it.
Oh, okay. Next question is from Peggy S., who asked, how can you tell if you're going through a spiritual crisis? And I remembered from Swedenborg in general that the crisis is spiritual if it involves leading you to struggle with issues about God, faith, trust, things like that of a spiritual nature. And this is New Jerusalem 187. Only people who are being regenerated experience spiritual crises. So it's a good sign because spiritual crises are times of mental anguish for people whose lives are devoted to goodness and truth. These crises are brought about by evil spirits. when they stir up the evils in us, an anxiety wells up inside that is a symptom of our spiritual crisis. We're not aware, however, where the anxiety is coming from because we do not realize that a spiritual crisis is its source. And then later he says there is also just earthly issue crises, which are just worried about, am I going to have enough money, or am I getting sick, or whatever. Spiritual crisis seems to go into like, can I trust God? It's getting you to wrestle with deeper issues. And it's actually a good sign, because that's why these things are allowed to have our stuff stirred up, because that turns our minds toward those deeper questions and to wrestle with them and struggle with doubt and everything, because ultimately that's going to strengthen the goodness. The final thing I'll read is what is at stake in crises of the spirit is either the dominance of goodness over evil or the dominance of evil over goodness. And so it's like you're struggling with, is God good? Is, just deep stuff.
I love the image from the Old Testament of Jacob wrestling with the angel. It's a wrestling match sometimes to just figure out what's happening inside your own thoughts and feelings, priorities and doubts and trust and all that stuff.
Yes.
You know what you just did there is like you used the Old Testament in the Swedenborg way. It's just like we were talking about for the first one. Because if it was actually a story of Jacob, this guy meets an angel and he's like, and they wrestle, and then since Jacob wins, the angel like will give him a blessing. There's no morality in that. Like in literally just like, all right, who's stronger? If I win, I get something. Like that's like every kid knows that as soon as you start any like sports or anything. It's like, if I'm stronger and I win, then I win. Like, what's that? What is that? But the truth of that is this is describing to you that this state that you're going to go through, so you can recognize that and know that and it can give you comfort and hope during that. Like, it's such a different thing, and it's useful now as we're doing this.
I liked that comment that just popped up.
What was that? Can you put that comment back on there? Symphony of God Ministries. As a spiritual, are you going to read it? Go for it.
Psychotherapist, I think and feel that if we are guided by the desire and practice to be in spiritual alignment with who we are, seems to lead to whole health, including mental health. So that's that idea too of just getting things in alignment, but and not caring to be in alignment and be who we really are in God's will. Yeah. So spiritual crises are those struggles that ultimately can lead to that, getting more in alignment, because it causes you to look at things that, you aren't usually looking at or thinking, like, do I trust in this situation as well as that? Or do I think I can do it on myself? Or do I realize I do need help sometimes from people or God? Or so it's anything that it can start with an earthly issue, but it's a spiritual crisis if it leads you to just struggle with those deeper priorities and things.
I remember when I was younger and I was going through what I felt like was a crisis. And then I was like reading Swedenborg and I was like, oh man, is this just like a natural crisis? Is this like, I don't know if this is a spiritual crisis or not. I thought I was getting the like the benefits of going through a spiritual crisis. Maybe this is just so I think one answer is you don't really know for sure if you're going through a spiritual crisis or not. I mean, you can have sort of indications on it, but even it's hard even to tell what is this really concerning. And it seems the way he describes it seems strange a lot of the time. We say, oh, you're worried about the deprivation of goodness and truth. Like, what do you even, who gets worried about that? What are you even talking about? But I was just reading, I don't know where it went, but this was actually in Secrets of Heaven. And it was talking about, I forget, it's some part of the Old Testament and explaining how this is describing what goes on inside you. And it was talking about how there's the pain that accompanies the deprivation of goodness and truth. or the loss of goodness and truth. And he even says, look, I know most people are going to think, what are you even talking about? Why would that be distressing? But you got to understand, and he goes in to say how when you're in a spiritual life, when the truth and love that you come into from your spiritual growth, when those are like your constant companions and they buoy you up throughout the day and they're your guidance and everything, when you don't have them, when those are in somehow in doubt or attacked, it's really distressing. And he says that it's because that stuff is what feeds and quenches the thirst of your spirit, just like food and drink do that to your body. So when you're deprived of those things, it can be really distressing. I don't know what that would, people probably experience it in different ways, but it is something that can be distressing.
Well, yeah, man. Well, okay. Deprivation of goodness and truth. So how many people are there in the world that think I'm a cosmic mistake? The Lord doesn't care about me. That is a very, very common human experience. And you could describe that as a deprivation of goodness and truth, because the truth is that you are not a cosmic mistake, that the Lord created you and the Lord is with you and loves you and is trying to help you. So to me, it often just comes down to the realities of like those, like talking about goodness and truth. It is very hard to hold on to sometimes in Swedenborg. But if you think about the realities of a human emotion, like George Dole used to say, these books are about us. If you don't know what the Latin is saying, look it up in yourself, he would say. Look it up in yourself. What is it in yourself that is a deprivation of goodness and truth? So I don't know. That's the thing, because so many people just feel like I'm a waste of time. I'm not worth anything. Don't waste your time helping me, like that kind of stuff.
Yeah, or I can't feel any love right now, or I don't know if I believe that anymore. It's those times where you're just kind of getting those, you don't know what to trust in.
I think an important moment in my coming to be really into Swedenborg happened when you, Mom, had just gotten me Kara's Secrets of Heaven Volume 1 that had just like come out, and I was reading it, and I was like, and somehow it was talking about falsities. I remember like being on a walk by the playground by our house, and I was like, oh well, because I sort of had like a sense of like the idea of God and religion was like a little stuffy and stodgy and not interesting. But I was like, that's like a falsity. Like that's a false belief, because that's not the actual case. Like what, and this now, like with like a near-death experience. If someone I remember hearing a guy in real life who was working somewhere I worked who had a near-death experience, and I was like, what is it like being in the light, which is like when you're near God? And he was like, it feels like anytime you've ever been in love plus Christmas morning, well, jacked up to a million. It's not at all. Like, it's actually the coolest that you take all your peak experiences and it's like that, but way better. But you have this falsity, which is that, oh, God's like, so. And for me to first, like, yeah, Carl, like you were saying, George Dole was talking about the books about. So I could see a falsity. I could see a falsity in my mind, and I could see how that falsity was making me less interested in what was in Swedenborg's books, because he's all talking about God all the time. And you have this falsity that God is less exciting than some other stuff, then you don't see the excitement of what's being talked about there.
Mm.
Let's move on. We got a million more questions to do. Well, not that many. Alice asks, can you give examples of how a living person would behave if he or she loves the neighbor, and if their main love is the Lord, God, showing the difference?
So I think so that sounds to me like, what would it look like if somebody's ruling love was loving the neighbor, as opposed to somebody's ruling love being loving the Lord? Is that what she's saying?
Mm-hmm. That's what I take it as.
Yeah. Okay. What does that look like? Yeah. What really helped me is Swedenborg saying love of the neighbor is also love of truth. Now here we're getting truth and goodness thing. Love of the Lord is love of goodness. And Curtis, actually, you gave I think it was a New Church Live talk one time that was really, bringing that all together in a great way, that being led by love of the neighbor, which is also love of truth, is like a more dutiful, you know that you should not be selfish. You know that you should not treat others except how you would want to be treated. And so you make a mental effort to act in a good way toward your neighbor. So it's more going through the mind and how you should behave, how you should not behave, because that's the truth. Like, it's not the truth that person is worse than me because I don't agree with them. So I need to act, well towards them. That's being led by love of the neighbor. Like, it's doing the right thing because that's the right thing. Whereas love of the Lord is love of goodness, which is like you just love the good in everyone. You don't need to think about it. You already know this is a lovable person. I know God loves this person. It's more impulse. It's more of an impulse to just love the goodness in people instead of going through more the mental exercise of recognizing that that's how you should treat others. So that's a start how I think of it. And I'll just briefly say that I had a spiritual experience once where I was just in a situation where I was in a bad state of mind and feeling critical thoughts about people that were around me. And I was distressed about that. Was against my conscience. And I prayed for just a change in that feeling. And I had this phrase come to my mind: they're all little pieces of God. And then I had this brief spiritual experience of feeling love pouring into the top of my head and just filling me. And I just loved everybody. Mm-hmm. And I felt like it was teaching me that when you love the Lord, when you connect, to love the Lord is to connect with the Lord, right? Have a close relationship. You just can't help but love everybody. So it leads that, instead of you having a little bit more of having to compel yourself through a love of truth. So I don't know if that makes any sense, but
no, it does. And I love that, the story of that experience. I just loved everybody. There you go. Like, hey,
it was overwhelming.
Yeah.
Oh, this is so wonderful.
I think we can't be upset with anybody for being confused by this.
Yeah.
This love of God versus love of the neighbor, because it is very confusing. And especially the way that Swedenborg deals with it, because he'll talk about love of God and love of the neighbor, which you think, okay, I understand what you mean. Love, I know what love is. So love of God means the love you feel for God. And love of the neighbor, that's the love you feel for the people. And I learned, through Jesus, that the neighbor is everybody. Okay, great. You got that sorted out. And it is a little strange to separate them. But whatever. But then Swedenborg goes on and says, actually, like, loving God means loving what's good, and loving the neighbor means loving what's true, which is totally new, a different thing than what they mean in the literal sense. And I'm just like, why even do the love of God, love of the neighbor language? Why not just talk about loving what's true and what's good? It's because Jesus talks about loving God and loving the neighbor. Those are the two great commandments. So that's a good starting point, I guess. A simple way. It's like, oh yeah, you got to love God and love the neighbor. But it's not, when you get down to it, it's not like, oh, loving God is like when you're like looking up at the sky and you're thinking about how God made everyone, and you like, I don't know, you've got like a picture of Jesus and you're like, man, you're so great. And then there's like, oh right, now then there's people over here, and loving them is when you're like helping them rake their yard. Like that's not it. Because that distinction breaks down, because the if you love me, feed my sheep. There's no loving God that is separate from loving people, because God only has one thing that he's excited about, which is the happiness of people. There's no just loving God. Like just love it. Like, here, God, you did all this stuff for other people. Now let me do something for you. Like, that's not what it is. The only thing that he wants for Christmas is the happiness of people, right?
So when you get closer to God, that just fills you. And
that's what it is. So what we
Yeah.
think of as loving the neighbor, what you
Mhm.
think of as having a good heart, that's more loving God than loving the neighbor, according to Swedenborg. Because loving the neighbor is, again, loving the truth is like the neighbor, because it's the thing by which we build the infrastructure that allows society to function. The truth is like a neighbor to everyone, because if it's a truth, do unto others as you'd have them do unto you. Well, that treats me well. It treats you well. It makes for a neighborhood of human beings. So I get it if people are perplexed by Swedenborg making that distinction. You don't lose any points for that. But I really love what he's saying about it. It makes better sense than, I like his explanation of it makes better sense than, like, there's two different things you got to do. One is love God. The other is love your neighbor. Like that to me is strange, and it's not as interconnected and loving, and doesn't paint as good a picture of God. Like, why do you need to love God? Like, what does God need your love? And why does he say, if you love me, feed my sheep then? But he should say, do you love me? And Peter says, I love you. And he's like, that's what I was looking for. Come in here. That's what I wanted, is you to love me. But it's not what he says. He says, if you love me, go and you don't know what loving me is. Loving me is feeding my sheep,
You did a great, I feel like it was not a very long show, but you did a great show, Curtis, about how loving God is loving the neighbor. And maybe that's the point that the show made. I don't remember the title of the show.
How would we know,
But I have to also second Karin. I too had, like, the only spiritual experience I've ever had when I was having a hard time with somebody that I love in theory, but I wasn't feeling loving toward them. And I just said a prayer like, please, Lord, just give me one drop of your love for this person. And it was the same feeling of something coming in the top of my head and filling up my whole body. Yeah, that was amazing.
Yeah.
Somebody in the chat said, I want some of that. Ask for it. You might get it.
What was it? But what was Sean Smith's comment that just popped up here that said, sometimes it's hard to figure out what a person needs to be loved? That's love of the neighbor. Okay. He's exemplifying there's love of God and love of the neighbor. Love of God is knowing I want to figure out how this person should be loved, because it's a desire to do it. Love of the neighbor is if you found to know what to do for that person, that's the truth that lets the love do what it wants to do. Love of the neighbor would be love of God is, I know I want to love this person. That's love of God. Love of the neighbor is, I figured it out. What they like is acts of service. So if I do an act of service for them, they'll feel that more than if I say I love you to them. That's love of the neighbor, is loving that truth, because the truth will let you,
Yeah, that's very good. Dawn had a nice comment there where she was saying she was kind of trying with an abstract love of God, and it just wasn't working. And then she just went into like being good to people or something, and then she realized it's all one. So just basically what you're saying, Curtis. Yeah. Loving God in abstract, found it too difficult, and just loved every person, flowers, food, then myself, and laughed because it was all one. Kind of got to that in the end. That
Yep.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, I mean, it is hard. There's a challenge to overcome, which is like, how do you love something that you don't really like? I mean, you guys are even talking about it's challenging even to love people that you are around, because you're like, this person is great, but they're also right now annoying me. How much more so when, we can get annoyed at the divine for the circumstances we're placed in or the nature of life, but also you don't even ever see the Lord. You don't even ever get to spend time with him. But there's two things, like Swedenborg talks about the importance of trying to form a conception of, he talks about like trying to connect with a God you don't understand is like looking out over the ocean and you don't see, but if it was like Jesus standing with his arms out, then so that's important. But also, to Don's point, Swedenborg talks about how I'm forgetting the phrasing now, but everything in the universe is reflective of the Lord's kingdom. everything is a correspondence, all those flowers, all those people and all that. So that is a way of seeing, like, that's how you understand tangibly who God is, because you're seeing, so that is something that it is a bridge to be crossed. It's like, how do you get enough of a conception of God to have affection for God? But it's the same thing as affection for goodness. The more you learn about goodness. Okay. All right. Great.
Yeah.
Next one. Butterfly asks, hello, my Swedenborg family. Hey, Butterfly. I have a question that's been weighing on me about animal suffering. Why do they have to go through so much suffering if they don't have free will? Thank you so much. Background for anyone who's not familiar, Swedenborg will say that for people, the only reason people go through things that are unpleasant or painful is for the sake of our reformation. So, Providence will only allow things that ultimately will benefit us spiritually and make us choose heaven. And Swedenborg does say that animals don't have that ability to destroy the image of heaven in themselves that we all do and that we've all made good use of. So why would animals suffer? What's that doing? Yeah, Mom.
Yeah, I feel that humans don't suffer because we have goodwill, but because of what we choose to do with our free will. So it's not an equate, like, because we have free will, we suffer. So maybe I'm not quite expressing that exactly. So therefore, a living creature that doesn't have free will, that doesn't mean they wouldn't suffer. So I'm trying to separate those two. But the thing I want to say is, first of all, that I believe the Lord is pained. God is pained in God's heart for any suffering of any part of God's creation. In the New Testament, Jesus says, "Are not two sparrows sold for a penny, yet not one of them will fall to the ground unperceived by your Father." And so, like, God is excruciatingly aware of every human that's suffering, animal that's suffering, part of nature that's suffering. And what Swedenborg learned is the rest of nature is affected by human choices. Like, we can just see that in just a very practical way, that we know that things that humans have done to mess up the environment and stuff or abuse animals or things like that. Obviously, that brings suffering. But there's also this spiritual component that we as human beings were created to be this link between the physical level and the spiritual level through the kind of mind we have. And there's just a couple of intriguing places in Swedenborg's books, one in Divine Love and Wisdom, 170 and 171, and then another place in Secrets of Heaven that I couldn't find, but that one says this intriguing thing, that if human beings could get our act back together and live according to our ordained order of life, which is to love one another, not do harm to each other, all of nature would get an upgrade, meaning we affect how much the influences that come into the physical plane. So even just out in I'm understanding that is even the suffering that goes out there in wildlife, where there aren't any people doing anything, would be alleviated, meaning all harm comes through from hell, all goodness comes from heaven, and the more heaven that's flowing into this world will affect everything in creation. So that's my thoughts about that. That the goal would be suffering stops. I think what Curtis was saying is it's allowed. We are allowed to go through suffering, and we can make each other suffer. We can't. This is part of what has to be in free will for this whole project to work. We have an effect on the world around us when we choose to do harm, and the more we choose to not do that anymore, the more everything will stop suffering. if you see what I mean. So
Yeah.
like it's the whole project is together. Like it's not we're not separate. We're so intricately connected to the animal world and the plant world and the spiritual world. Like when we get our act together, it's gonna make things better for everything in creation.
But what about the? Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Curtis.
No. What? Because what's your question going to be?
Well, I'm just thinking about like the what is it called? The circle of life or whatever.
Yeah.
The hierarchy, the chain of like, tigers are meant to eat antelope or whatever it is. Lions,
Okay.
And that seems to be part of the order of creation. So
that's what I want to talk about.
Okay, good.
Because I think at the heart of this question, I think we've said a lot of good things about it so far, but at the heart of this question is like, if you all heard that I hit some misfortune, like, something had happened to me, I hurt my arm, or like my bank account got hacked or something like that. I mean, from a Swedenborgian perspective, you would think like, okay, God is only permitting this so that some good may come out of it. That in periods of spiritual crisis and all that, even Jesus' suffering on the cross, what was happening there was he's forging more of a partnership with God and and regenerating and rejecting evils and all that stuff. But the antelope that you mentioned, if it's getting killed by tigers, it's not, the antelope doesn't need to regenerate. Like, it's already in the order of its life. So what good is coming out of that suffering? So this is not something that's in Swedenborg, but I'm inferring it. So I think it must be that animals are not suffering as often as they seem like they are. And I only say this because humans are not suffering as often as they seem like they are. So the near-death experience, the lesson of that, and this is also, we had a show a long time ago on this channel called Does It Hurt to Die? And we had Tom Rose on here, who was a Swedenborgian minister, but also then a paramedic for a long, long time. And he said that over interactions with so many people who had been through the worst of what you can think of, like he's talked about the car accidents, like the steering wheel goes through them and all this, everybody universally, people who have been through the most violent things, report one of two things. One is they have no memory of the event, or two, they had a spiritual experience. So for, I think about Mary Neal's, her experience when she drowned in a kayak. And she was like in the kayak, and she describes it like, I could feel my legs were breaking, but I wasn't really feeling it. Like, I was aware that it was happening, but I wasn't really feeling it. And then people, they're off somewhere. I know there was another book of spiritual experiences that we'd referenced here, where a woman was murdered in prison because she was there trying to help an inmate. She was a counselor or something, but the inmate killed her, and her friend was all chewed up with worry. Like, what were her last moments like? That must have been so horrible. But then her friend who had been killed came to her and showed her like these gems and said, God turned those last moments into just like joy, like happiness and peace. So if human beings, it seems like there's people don't, but you see, like, the people that go through these accidents seem like they're suffering, but they're not really. So why would it be that people are shielded from that, but the antelope who's being killed by the tiger, even though we've all seen National Geographic and it seems like there's a bunch of suffering, why would it be that God like pulls the plug on the consciousness of us when something horrific, but he wouldn't do that for an antelope who doesn't need to regenerate? I think it must be that there's not as much suffering in the animal world as we think that there is.
That's great. I have thought before. Yeah, that's absolutely right. And even I came across a just interesting thing in a book about other people writing about talking with Swedenborg, just earthly people, like at the time he was on Earth, and conversations they had. And one was talking about someone asked Swedenborg, what about people who are on their way to the chopping block to be executed? And he said, well, before they're actually getting their head cut off, they're actually pulled out of their body. So, yeah, I mean, anyone watching would would see them walking up and seeming to be very there and conscious to the end. So I think that's a great point, Curtis, and it touches on, I've often thought about, like, Swedenborg says that animals have much more of a collective consciousness than we humans do, where we do have a collective consciousness too, but we also have this very individual thing. You know, I'm just watching the sparrows in my backyard, how connected they are to each other and everything. And I wonder if they're, in addition to what you said, that if they are, less alone feeling in a way, if they're, they're separated from their herd and the tiger is after them or whatever, that there just would be, they're more together with their,
hey, look at what Butterfly's in the chat. And Butterfly said we did a good job. It's like our hero, the question asker, is here. Hey, sorry guys, we got to go. We have to answer 2 more questions, and we don't have that much time.
5 minutes.
Let's do this. But thanks for the question, Butterfly. Kay asks, why is it that when we shun evils as sins against God, can they not be removed completely, but are only moved to the periphery? This is something Swedenborg talks about. Yes, Cara.
Well, quick thought. He says that every single experience, thought, feeling, vision that we have is stored in our internal memory or whatever he calls it for some point, for some reason, and it can be called on whenever it's necessary. Even in my, short life of 66 years, when I think about the crises that got me to the point of wanting to repent of something, it seems important to me to remember what got me there and the contrast between my misery then and my relative peace now, okay, somebody else.
Yeah. That's so great, because that's exactly the kind of thing I was thinking, that they are evils, so to speak. There's a whole difference between what's at our center and what's at our periphery, and when our inherited or actualized evils are at our center, that's a problem. But to have them be at our periphery, they give us this both a humility and a wisdom, right? Like, because you have struggled with that and clearly seen that you don't want to be it, just keeping that as a part of you is that realization of what you don't want to be anymore,
Yeah.
And then also a reminder of, like, there without the Lord go I, just so a humbleness and a wisdom.
I think like antibodies. I think it's like you, even if you could say, oh, I never really struggled with that or never did that. I think that's how heaven deals with hell. Is like, okay, I've got these certain areas of hell that I'm an expert in, because they were hanging out in me for a while. And I think throughout my eternity, I'm going to continue to be able to make progress for heaven against those things, or something like just like in your body, the virus is long gone, but you got these antibodies stored up. It's out and to the side, but maybe it's there or something. So I would think it's both, because that's just how things are built. Like if you just look at the way that a person forms, like if you have something happen to you when you're like a fetus, or that just, you can't start over. Like it just progression has to go, and it has to build on the next thing. So you can't eliminate like that. But you can change and grow, well beyond. It just seems to be the way that order functions. Is like, stuff is in there, but I think ultimately then, yeah, it's got to be for good. It's got to be that you wouldn't want to not have it expunged, because I don't know, like this is part of your calling, is to deal with that thing or something. Yeah. Okay, let's pretend that it's not already 3. This is question number 7. Aaron asks, does God want us to actively pursue finding someone? For example, joining a dating site, or does he wish for us not to lean on our own understanding and wait on him to provide someone? Okay, so there's someone you're talking about, like a maybe conjugal partner in Swedenborgian parlance. Yeah, let's figure this out.
It's a partnership. Like everything in life. It's like we make effort, but also you make effort when you feel moved to, and also trust. So with finding a life partner, I feel like that can go in phases for people. Some people totally worked to go on the dating site and they found their true love. And for others, they'll try the dating scene for a long, long time and finally say, you know what, I'm just going to do other things. And that's fine too, because we don't know the timing of when it's going to be right to find our eternal partner. It might be in this world, it might be in the next. But I think the important thing is just to hold a desire for that kind of relationship, because if you want it, the Lord will fulfill it. It might be in this world, it might be in the next. And like everything in life, it's a partnership. So any efforts we make are not wasted. We're just learning things all the time. And if you can also hold trust that, okay, this might work, this might not, but it's going to be okay. I will find that person eventually. That's my thoughts.
Lovely. And I love the Swedenborgian concept that the Lord leads us through our loves, what we care about. So if somebody feels motivated, like Corinne said, or called to try to find somebody, have at it. The Lord's leading you and you get to try what might work. I don't think there's a right or wrong answer about this question. It's just it's so individual, and just ask the Lord, hey, what do you think? Any good ideas for what I should try next?
Yeah. I think everybody wants to have good luck in romance, but it's also not even it not happening, like you're not meeting someone, doesn't necessarily mean things are not going well. Obviously we're sitting here on this Swedenborg channel, and he's got this incredibly lofty revelation about marriage, love, and so forth. He never got married. He didn't. I don't know how hard he even tried. I know that at one point he said he had a suspicion of someone who he thought maybe, that he would be partnered with in the afterlife. I think that I'm not sure about this, but I believe the perfect way to be doing life, according to Swedenborg, is you act as if there's no God at all, but you believe that God rules everything and does everything, and you leave and you're content in whatever results God does. So I think you see this in Swedenborg's publishing of the writings, is that he didn't just say like, well, we'll see if the Lord spreads these through the earth or not. Like he was trying very hard. I mean, this was in, I think, Dr. Rose's introduction to the 1763s, just like, okay, we'll try to give it to this noble person. We'll go and meet with these kings, and we're going to try to ruffle these feathers and send it. Like, he was trying very, very hard. And yet when like angels would talk to him and say, hey, you're not selling any books, he would like be upset about it, but he'd also say like, it's up to the Lord's providence. That I think that's what it is like, act as if, I think is the phrase that's used. So I would think like, sure, you can go on a dating site. Sure. However, the perfect way is at the same time to be like, I'm going to go on here, but the results are up to the Lord. And look, oh, this result, nobody gave me a whatever, like a thumbs up or a heart, or I didn't meet anyone. Okay, that's the best thing in Providence. Like if we were robots, I'm not there myself about anything, but I think that's like you would. It's like this: if somebody needs help in the street, they're going to get hit by a car. Like, of course, you go run out and try to do it, but your belief would be like, well, God did that if it worked, and if the person got hit by the car, even though I would have had to try, well, it was just like that was their time to go.
Yeah.
So it's like
that's interesting when you say act as if there is no God, meaning we have to take responsibility for what we're doing in our life. Not that God's just going to snap his fingers and make something happen.
That song, like Jesus, take the wheel. There's like some like Carrie Underwood or something.
Yeah.
No. You can't. You have to drive the car. Jesus can't drive the car. Like you have to drive it. You can't. Not religious to be like, well, you know what? Jesus, take the wheel. You take the wheel and drive it. But at the same time, you acknowledge that the only reason I can drive is that is the Lord. It seems like it's me, but it's actually the Lord. And the outcome of this drive is in the hands of divine providence. So it's this interesting combination. Act as if there's no God, meaning, we need to chop wood. We need to carry water. God's not going to do that. I have to go do that. At the same time, thank you, God, for this wood. Thank you, God, for this water. Whether or not I have enough wood and water, I trust in your hands that you'll do that. Like that's what I think that's the way you're supposed to try to do it, you know? And there's nuance all through there. Like, I do think it's really important to not be like, you can get way too caught up in results. I'd do that about our work here, like with Swedenborg Foundation. I'd be like, this thing needs to go better. That needs to, I think I'm a little too wrapped up in that. But then again, that gets me to try hard. So I don't, like, it's somewhere in there, but okay, you know?
It's a process of developing the partnership.
Yeah.
Thanks everybody for these great questions. That was fun, wasn't it?
That was
Yes.
fun.
Great questions. As
For
always.
members,
Yeah,
if you're a member supporting our organization, thank you so much. Let's hop on over to the chat and we can all talk in person on like Zoom about what we learned today.
Yeah, can I just say that it looks like some people were submitting questions in the chat, but that's not actually how it works these days. We've gotten the questions elsewhere and are discussing them here,
So,
but we're not
Yeah,
taking live questions in the chat.
yeah, that's right. So what we're doing, this is sort of a thank you to, there's this thing called community membership, which is where you're giving a monthly amount to the Swedenborg Foundation, which we're not for profit. We have to have contributions to go. So people who are, if you get that membership, we send out something that says, submit your questions, and then we take them and we answer them here. We answer them for everybody. You can watch it, but the questions are from members. So if you're a member and you're asking those questions, come on into the member chat. We'll talk about them. If you're not, type them in a comment on a YouTube video. We'll get it, or consider becoming a member. That will help us, and then we'll be able to do that. We try to give away everything we can, but the same thing. Act as if we got this partnership. If the bank account is empty, that's the end. That's the end of the publishing the books. That's the end of making the video. Like, it cannot happen. So we want to give a thanks to the people who are contributing. Okay, let's go jump over to the Zoom. Thank you everyone for watching. We'll see you later.
Merry Christmas, everyone.